All right, and everyone, welcome back to the next episode of the Information Revolution. This is episode 20. I can't believe we've got here. The Information Revolution is a podcast
Amazing.
for people who are involved in the information industry. My name is Karl Melrose. I work for Castlepoint Systems in Canberra. My views are my own, and I'm here with my two co-hosts, Michael.
My name is Michael Upton, and I'm in Wellington, New Zealand. I'm an information management consultant and director of a little company called Metataxis.
And I'm Judi Vernau. I'm an information architect. I also work for that little company in Wellington called Metataxis. So, Karl, what are we talking about today?
Well, Judi, I'm so glad you asked.
Be a short episode otherwise.
Very quiet. So I'm introducing today because today we are talking about a topic that could actually be quite short because, I'm definitely not a wellspring of knowledge, but I think it needs to be discussed in its databases. Ultimately, the field that we spend, or the place we all spend a lot of our time working, is government records. And databases are this thing that we just seem to pretend don't exist. And I think it's a real cause for concern for starters, but I think the dynamics of the way we've avoided it are really interesting, because we've got, definitions of what's a public record. And, ultimately it comes down to, any piece of information, used by a public servant, in the transaction of their duties is a public record and must be kept. And, the definition is slightly different in every Records Act, but that's what it boils down to. And then we hit, and so, we go around and, anytime there's a document, an object, a thing, we get very wound up about, putting it into a record system and having a BCS and managing through a life cycle and, classifying correctly. And then we hit a business system and we just pretend it doesn't exist. And that blows my mind for starters, but it's becoming an increasingly large problem because the trend is towards more structured data. It's not away from structured data, so that, there's all kinds of, IDC and Gartner things saying that, volume of unstructured data is going up, dramatically. And it is. But the volume of structured data is going up dramatically. And I think the volume of, particularly with SaaS, the volume of structured data being used because of business systems is going up dramatically because the cost of business systems is actually coming down. When could you go to or when could you ever go to market and get a business system to manage a finance process or something like that for $21 a month, which I think is the base cost of Xero, or $19 per month per user, which is Basecamp, the project management product, and we have no affiliations with those; they're just the ones I pulled out of the top of my head, or any of those kinds of SaaS products. And so, I think we're actually probably stumbling into two related topics here, but there's business systems and databases and SaaS applications, which ultimately are a business system that sits on a database. They're things that we as an industry have to come to grips with managing through a life cycle. And I'd be interested in what the two of you think. Are we, is there just a nice separation of duties around records and data, and is that what we're actually seeing? We're seeing the two of them running together, or am I just overthinking this?
I think it's interesting that certainly in New Zealand, if I've understood this correctly, that the General Disposal Authority hardly mentions databases. There's a whole section devoted to records about databases and the procuring of them and all that stuff, but that's over there. But thinking about information stored in those databases, there is mention, but very little mention. I was looking through the finance part of it, and I couldn't see any mention at all about managing what's in a financial system as a record. So there's nothing there to kind of trigger people to think about how they should be dealing with what's in the databases, as far as I can see, and I'm absolutely no expert in this area. But the other side of it, well, there are two other sides of it. One is you're supposed to give access to these records. So they're supposed to be maintained in an accessible form, which I guess is okay for the few people who use the database, but is that accessible by anybody else? And what happens if these things get transferred to archives? How on earth are they going to, what are they going to do with it? All these different database formats. How?
There's a million things I could say about all this stuff. So
Go for it.
Well, let's begin. Let's begin at the beginning. And
Yeah.
So I think of the data problem. I mean, I think of this as just being an extension of that concept that the format shouldn't determine whether or not something is a record, and I think that's really well established. And yes, I definitely see a pattern that you're describing, Karl, where people say that and then in their actions don't actually really do that much. Go, oh yeah, you know, um, this key system, it was procured by someone without our involvement, and that's a pity. Seems to be the extent of the interaction sometimes with some of those line of business systems. Then there's a stage of people going, let's figure out if we can create some kind of an integration that basically periodically exports things in a form that we can deal with, that we think of as more like
Yeah.
documents. And, and documents have more traditionally been the purview of records people. And, I'm actually not super opposed to that, because I think that you're at least putting some effort into thinking about what is a record in that context. You're going, all right, well, actually, we're not actually saying absolutely all the things are records in the same way that you would hopefully kind of try and weed out the rot or the dross or whatever we call it if you're thinking in a document context. But it does seem like it's an incredibly risky approach, I think, and an incredibly resource-intensive approach to say, all right, we're going to try and massage stuff, within a database into some other form. I mean, it's essentially format shifting in the same way that, for instance, you might convert an Excel spreadsheet into a PDF and then submit that to someone, and you've immediately lost some of what the people using that record got from that record.
I mean, it throws up that
In the physical context. Sorry, I'll just quickly add, there's really, really common trend here. Gosh, can't think when this was. I think it's the early 90s, where people went nuts on microfiching things
Oh, yes.
and destroying the source, going, oh, that's great. Now we can keep
Yeah. Now we've got it.
things
Yeah.
so efficiently, and then finding all the problems in what they'd done. Which is something I think a lot of digitization projects have learnt from. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up as a kind of an example that's pretty well understood of the risks in format shifting. And so that idea of like, oh, we'll sort of make records out of our business system somehow. I think
we'll make objects out
it's
of
the
our
same.
business system. It does.
Yeah,
I mean,
make objects, have a records object when we, because we traditionally have the
yeah,
metadata
we
plus
are an
the object.
object-centric kind of profession, right?
Yeah,
but I mean, it does
and
throw up.
it's risky.
Yeah, but it does throw up that idea of what is the record as well. I think that's
Yeah.
ultimately what we're trying to consider, and that idea that we can take a point in time copy of the data that's there and say that's the record. I mean, that's interesting, but I mean, if you wanted to really get into it, and the kind of thing that I think a judge would decide is that whatever view that public servant or person had of that record at the moment they made a decision, that's the record. And I think ultimately that's what the problem boils down to. It boils down to the fact that you've got a database, but then on top of the database you've got a business application that gives you a composable view of a certain slice of that data. So, it's going to pull together a certain number of tables, but then you might have a totally different business system that uses the same database and also relies on many of those tables and a different composable view. I mean, the simple,
Yeah, absolutely.
the simple way for people to get their heads around that, if I haven't explained it well, is, you go to, like SharePoint, SharePoint, you've got different views that you can give to different users, and if you want to put a column of metadata in, well, you can put a different column in based on who's viewing the library. And I mean, well, there's an interesting idea. If people are going to make decisions based on that library and the metadata that shows, well, you have to be able to recreate. How do you recreate that view that person had at that point in time? Is what it comes down to.
That's a really, really good point. Just thinking of it from an information architecture view, because you're setting up the metadata around each information object. Let's say it's a survey or something like that, or a questionnaire, and you're just pulling out the key points from that into a list. And what is the record? It must be the individual survey or whatever this is, and the list, and the item in the list,
and the way that the person viewed the list at the moment they made the decision, because it was used in the transaction of government, and it blah blah. It's a record. It must be kept.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, particularly around something like housing, and you could view the information in the database around the particular dwelling, but then maybe you want a completely different view of all of that, which is all the people who live in that dwelling, or I don't know, all the repairs that were done on that dwelling. There's so many different views. How do you couldn't approach it like that, surely. You'd have to have that. It's got to be all or nothing.
Yeah, so I mean, so this really does get into the guts of what is it to create a record, or what is the record, because it's not like a sort of logical sort of other extreme of the alternative in terms of how you might maintain a database is you keep the whole database, right? But then is there additional stuff you need, which is basically what the two of you are saying, to actually understand how that was used and what combinations of data drove what decision making, and led to certain outcomes. And it's almost like you need a handbook,
Well, I mean,
I shouldn't laugh. I mean, it kind of is.
But you kind of need the business application. And it's interesting that in our industry there's something I've noticed lately is that there's a bunch of companies springing up who their whole thing that they're doing is retiring old business applications like SAP and old instances of SAP and old instances of all kinds of things. But the reason that they're these old instances of whatever have been kept running in the background because people expect that at some point they'll have to be able to refer back to them, and they cost millions of dollars. But
it's the access issue again.
But it's not just the access issue. It's the how is the data composed into what we see. So it's you've got a finance system over there, and if you've got a big ERP system, well, you may have one database that sits on it'll be like at a logical level, it will be lots of databases, but when what you actually see in the business application side of that's going to be pulled together from lots of different databases, lots of different tables in that thing. But the view that you see is the important thing. And the idea, I think, that you can keep the database. I mean, even though, there's this whole people get into what I think are silly arguments, maybe I can be proven wrong on this, but what I think are silly arguments about whether databases are data or information. I mean, they're information. Anyway, if you ever had a look at the table structure of a database, you've got information presented in a context, you've got data presented in a context, it's information, and by the time it gets presented, and by the time it gets presented to someone in a business application, definitely information. They're definitely using it, but it's how it's presented to them.
Sometimes people make a distinction of a data set, like refer to a data set, the idea that you might collect almost like a static or one-time set of data from, say, a research thing, and you might say, oh, that's just data. But it's still like, well, as soon as you have used that as evidence for a record, you might say, oh, it's facilitatory and we can chuck it out, as in facilitative, like it just, we've created a good enough record somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
But still, you have to consider it. You still have to consider it as a record, I think. Yeah. And to me, it's just kind of, it's games. It's games.
Yeah.
We need to think about the outcomes that we're actually trying to get to. And if we just split hairs on that stuff, then I don't think we're actually focused on the right thing. We're not looking at what's the outcome we're
No,
trying
it's
to achieve,
how does the
which is
technical
not
issue contribute to the outcome? Yeah.
exactly. Our outcome is not to have good definitions for what data and information are. We've got all the other outcomes. I feel like about a decade ago, I worked at Archives New Zealand here, and that was when we were first establishing the government digital archive, and there was a lot of talk about digital preservation, and they had dedicated digital preservation staff and so on. And I really feel like, um, there is this kind of niche or profession of digital preservation that would be fascinating if we could pull some people in who actually work in that world. But
Mm.
I think from the outside, it's often seen as a thing where you're just worrying about file formats. But really, you have to go deeper. You have to be talking about what are these things that we're trying to capture. And I do remember a conversation. I think it was part of a conference. There was a conference called Future Perfect back in 2012 was the last one. And that was basically pulling together digital preservation people. They all came to Wellington. And there was this great conversation about sort of glam sector. Like if you're in a gallery, if you're in a library, you're in an archive, you're in a museum, what does it mean to do digital preservation? Which is, like, words aside, is almost the same question of what is the record, as in what is it we're trying to preserve, and talking about how, imagine for an artwork, I don't want to go too deep into that world, but what is it you're trying to maintain if you've got a digital artwork to make that thing still, I don't know, an experience that others can share. And then you go all the way to, there was a question at the time, this is, at least 10 years ago now, on do we just basically care about informational content of what we're preserving? So should we sort of try and let go of the formats, and should we be trying to just capture the informational content? And I think it's not right when you're trying to, if one of your aims is to understand how someone made a decision, or what information someone kept that led to they did, basically, and in the context of sort of government accountability and so on. I just think you can't just keep the informational content, really, for the reasons that we've just been saying. You need some kind of view of, almost a view of the view, like what was the person looking
Right.
at?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
did the person approach decision
Yeah,
Well, that
making?
I
would be the
see.
best thing. That would be the best thing to
Mm.
try and preserve.
But
Yeah.
I mean, how did the person approach decision making? I mean, in that context, to me, is the thing that immediately sticks out because, I mean, if you've got the type of person who, likes their EA to print all of the documents so that they can read them and, make margin notes and all of those kinds of things, well, what's the process they go through when they make a decision? It actually starts to become important. If they make it on paper, things aren't searchable. What assumptions do you make about how that person makes decisions? I mean, I'm trying to explain something that I don't think I've actually tried to explain it before. I don't have a good analogy for it, but it's that idea of, I guess, let's fast forward 50 years into the future or go back 50 years into the past. I mean, when there's no other option but paper, everything gets to you on paper. You read it, you make a decision, you make the decision on paper, you move it on. Fast forward 50 years into the future. I mean, I think paper's still going to be around. But are there going to be a lot of people who actually understand how the paper world works and the constraints that are put on you, and that you can't search things? And
Oh, that's an interesting
are we going to
question.
start looking at? Are we going? We're going to, people in the future are going to impose their values and their ways of making decisions on people in the past just because you can't help it. Are they going to understand that these things came in on paper and this person actually sat at their desk and read these things and might not have done it in one sitting? So the maintenance of context between reading the start of the document and the end of the document might not be great. And there's 4,000 different things that, but I actually think you've got to maintain an understanding of that sort of thing. Did this person?
So
We're getting off topic.
we're talking about
No.
the information itself, as Michael said, but we're also talking about, as it were, the presentation layer,
Yes.
whether it's paper or it's electronic. How is it presented? to people, and what is it about that would help them to make that decision? And as far as I can see, presentation layers are getting increasingly sophisticated all the time. So the underlying data may be this, but now we've added all these algorithms on the top, and now we've got we've got a decision tree, or we've got an ontology full of cool relationships. What exactly is it that we're preserving?
That comes back to your question earlier, Judi, about sort of like what does it mean to maintain access to these things? And that's why I mentioned
Yeah,
access earlier.
yeah.
Like it's not just access as in I can get to it, but it's
But
access as in sort of enough context or enough stuff that I know what's going on, or
Yeah.
I'd have a reasonable chance to,
And thank you.
I know how to interpret this. Yeah.
You've actually just articulated exactly what I was trying to get to, which is, this person, when they get this stuff, this thing that they're making a decision on, what is there? Do they have a decision tree that they use, to essentially arrive at an outcome? Are they just ticking? Are they just signing the thing with their authority when the decision's really been made by 10 people, who had to approve this thing to get to them? How do we maintain that kind of context around things? Is what I was fumbling around.
And I think even if we pull it all the way back to the lovely land of documents and think about EDRMS and so on, if you've gone, and I definitely am including 365 in this, that if you're running workflows and processes and things, to what extent is documentation of those workflows or
yeah,
processes sort of a informative, basically? I mean,
yeah.
trying to stay away from being too compliancy, just thinking about whether it's a good idea. Do you want to try and keep that stuff? Always these things will come up against sort of a prioritization thing of like, well, is that our highest priority? But I feel like there must be times to provide sort of transparency. It would be really valuable to sort of go, hey, this bit was actually, we automated this. Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, there's value judgments all through this, which is
yeah. And
the problem.
I deliberately brought it back to documents because I think some of those judgments exist in the document context, and we may have not sort of pulled out those assumptions before in our work. We might have just gone, yeah, I'm collecting documents with metadata that directly attaches to that document or to its bucket, basically to its aggregation. Yeah.
But I mean, it does that is actually an interesting question for the database as well, because, I mean, if you've got a case that's being worked on, and I can think of 50 government agencies that, I've done stuff with that have got case management systems of one type or another. When is the record? Is the record, the person whoever it is, phones in and we open a case for this person and we collect some basic information. Well, there's is that the record? Then when their case gets routed to the specialist who actually, or routed to the specialist for our UK audience. It's my networking background coming out again. Everything's a router. Does it, the specialist that actually looks after it, I mean, at what point is the record, and I mean, I think that's the paper world. This stuff was relatively easy because you couldn't edit stuff. You create the artifact, it goes to the person. And I mean, I think it's interesting. I think that we're also coming back to lots of issues of data minimization and those sorts of things for privacy. And I mean, ultimately, I mean, for me, I think with databases, the thing we actually have to do is we have to go right back to the record keeping. What's the moment that the record is kept, and that's the bit that we have to start to focus on.
What's in my mind is I would try and stay away from sort of a conceptual conversation about what is a record or what's not a record, and more come back to, well, why do we say that we want to keep records? So the kinds of things that we talked about a few episodes back around, basically what's it for? And then based on what's it for this set of information, well, which of those things is likely to apply? For example, do we need to demonstrate that decisions were being made to show, I don't know, transparency of public spending, or
is this administrative review? Is it legal review? Is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Were decisions made that affected individuals' lives? Those kinds of things. Or have we captured information that changes people's entitlements or obligations with the Crown? So, if you can, I mean, it's hard. It's hard. It's a lot of thinking and talking. But I think if you can kind of operate at that level, then you can work backwards from that and go, okay, well, what do we need? And what would be good enough, or within that context, without getting too caught up in sort of debating which things are records and data and information and knowledge and all that stuff.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I did want to chuck in something that just a practical point about one of those digital preservation techniques that I heard. So talked about format shifting, the idea that basically you try and copy things and capture them in different ways. Um, the Swiss Federal Archive had a thing which was called, come on brain, SIARD, I think it is, SIARD, which is actually software they built to sort of take away the software dependency, if you like, on a bunch of popular database formats. So in terms of that sort of question of could we basically capture a whole database and keep it as an archive, they tried to answer it that way, which I found
Wow.
really interesting because it's just tackling
Yeah.
that technical level. It's just
Mm.
like how do we strip stuff out of like a popular database would be SQL Server. How do you remove the dependency on having the right versions and all that stuff and having to maintain the SQL Server at your archive? But then the flip side, and I know Jeff Rothenberg is a really big proponent of this from back thinking of that conference in 2012. He said that's not good enough to try and get that kind of application layer that we're talking about in this
Yeah,
podcast.
the presentation layer is the important thing.
You
Mm.
you actually want to investigate emulation. So emulation's a technology where you
Yeah.
basically load up your OS in a virtual environment from that point of time, and you do everything from, okay, it was this version of Windows to these systems sitting on Windows, up and up and up, and and this was what the application looked like. And that stuff's got so advanced that you can do that stuff in a browser now. Like you can, go out there and you can find Mac OS 7 and play with it and load different utilities and things inside your web browser. But the key thing that I think is way, way, way harder when we're talking about, our context is the fact that you're talking about networked systems and interactions between many systems. So when you're talking about emulation, it's like, how do you emulate that business system
That's
and
integrated with
then the
5 other
users
things,
access?
and
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Yeah,
This
Exactly.
is
it's so much harder than just like I can load an app, like a standalone, like I can open Word and see what Word looked like.
And
Anyway,
how much difference does it make that so much is in the cloud anyway?
well, I mean, this is the
What
next thing.
effect does that
This is
have?
this is just the next thing. But I mean, these companies that have got these technologies, and these are the ones that I was referring to earlier. Essentially, what they're doing is they're scraping the presentation layer, and it's kind of my understanding of the technology is that it's happening just like a web scraper does. It scrapes a web page, and then you have another, kind of like the Wayback Machine does, and those sorts of things. And it's exactly what you were just saying, Mike. Well, it's not. It's sort of a
not
you could
exactly,
either
but
I
yeah,
guess what we're talking about is we're
it's
talking about
aiming
a
for the
view
same thing.
where we're talking about a view where you just keep the database, and then the one you're talking about is, well, we need to emulate the entire operating system, software stack, application,
Technology
Yeah.
stack, yeah,
access stack, the whole bit. And then this is somewhere in the middle, I think, where it's sort of saying, well, if you had a case management system, we're just going to scrape all the possible views that case management system can present its users, and we're going to keep them somewhere that is a way. It means that you don't have to keep paying your SAP licensing, or what it is, because that's ultimately the thing that that's the problem of half of digital preservation. It's, do we maintain, do we keep that SAP instance sitting around in the basement, even though it costs our agency $5 million a year to do so? I mean, how can there'd have to be a pretty strong argument about how that's a good use of public money, I think. Be interesting
sure.
though too. how many of these systems actually have a longevity where they need to be kept for 10, 15, 20 years. I've got a friend at one of the federal government departments here, and she routinely destroys information in business systems. She sits down, she looks at the data, she looks at the database, looks at how it's accessed, looks at the logic around all of the cases, and then she just works out what she just classifies them, and it's a bit of a hand kind of classification exercise. It's right, well, all of these cases are XYZ, this is the retention class, they're retained 5 years, and so therefore, here's my trigger event. It's the end of that, gets the case closure or whatever it is, and great. Here are all of the cases that were closed more than 5 years ago. IT, delete the cases. And she actually just runs runs disposition processes across databases. And yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that wonders why it's, we're starting to get into some of the reasons that's difficult. You've got one business application that, might refer to a HR type record. Here is your HR file, but then your finance record refers to that. So how do you figure out the mishmash of retention classes that are in conflict, so that you can delete the entire record at the database layer? You've got table integrity to consider and those sorts of things, but there's someone doing something about it.
Oof. I mean, there is so much to say on this topic. Like, I don't feel like we've scratched the surface of, you're thinking about how do you make sure you retain once you've decided what records are, what is it you need to retain for as long as trying to protect from destruction. Then there's the stuff about archiving and getting stuff out, which I think was most of what we're covering. But then there's also, what you just mentioned then, Karl, of like, the secure destruction of subsets of data. And I think, just very briefly on that last point, that there was certainly a big period of time in which destruction just couldn't be done. Like that software wasn't configured. Line of business systems that were purchased off the shelf weren't set up to actually get rid of the data.
Well, most of them still aren't. I don't think that's.
And they say, oh, you mean archive, and absolutely make every records and information person sweat. No, it's not an archive. But move stuff to offline
or
storage.
Even worse. Oh, you mean backup? That's one of the.
Yeah,
I know. There's a can of worms, but that is actually something that we are getting into with an agency. Anyway,
And more and more people or more organizations are really getting smarter about storing. Well, I don't know. There's two different ways, isn't there? Storing everything in one place rather than having 6 different databases with overlapping stuff. Let's create one. Or, of course, the alternative is let's do this layer which just pulls things out. But there's a lot of overhead in maintaining 6 different databases. So why don't we get smarter and just create one that does everything that we need? And so what happens then? I mean, I'm asking you guys because you know better than I do.
I don't know.
What happens to the 5 that have just been or the 6 actually that have been decommissioned to make way for the beautiful new one?
Yeah,
are they records? those old systems, those old databases that we've decided we don't need anymore because we've got a better shiny one that we've migrated everything into. They are still a record of how information was found at that time. So
lots of thinking about that.
back to that context.
People do lean towards the content was successfully migrated, and so therefore we can destroy. And I mean, I'll be upfront that in practice, I think that's often the only reasonable approach, because just the amount of resources required to answer that other question about the presentation layer, it's just not worth it. But I do wish the conversation was had more often, because I don't think it's even discussed, as in, have we made a conscious choice that, although it would be desirable to capture the presentation layer, in this case, that's not going to work, Yeah.
I mean, something that I keep, I mean, this will be interesting in the future, because Judi, I keep running into agencies that are building data lakes. That seems to be the
yes, exactly.
That seems to be the trend. It's let's build.
It's the way to go. Yeah.
Which I mean, I barely even understand what I barely even understand what a data lake is, at this point. So, I mean, what does that mean for records management? What does that mean for trying to keep that record of what people saw and how they saw it? And I really don't know. So, I mean, maybe we should get someone on who can really talk about this stuff, and someone does spring to mind. So, watch this space. Well, that might be a time to wrap us up then. Thank you, everybody who watched, and we are always really interested in your comments, and if you've got real insight into what this stuff means, please reach out, leave comments. You can pick the podcast up in all kinds of places, so please just leave comments on the YouTube page, or we do read them, we do respond. But until next time, thanks very much for watching, and thanks Michael and Judi.
Here ends episode 20. Thank you.
Bye for now.